Good evening and welcome to SleeepLore. Tonight, we're going to spend some time with one of the world's most familiar companions. It sits beside us during quiet mornings, long conversations, road trips, study sessions, and early commutes. It has inspired entire industries, influenced politics, crossed oceans, survived wars, and become a daily ritual for billions of people. And yet, despite how common it is, very few of us know where coffee actually came from. If someone handed you a steaming mug this morning and asked you to trace its history backward, how far do you think you could go? Perhaps to the grocery store where the beans were purchased, maybe to a roasting company whose name appears on the bag. If you're especially interested in coffee, you might even know the country where those beans were grown. But what if we continued traveling backward, before coffee was sold in cafés, before espresso machines hissed behind polished counters, before paper cups, before ceramic mugs, before sugar was stirred into dark roasted beans? Coffee existed as something entirely different. It was simply a small shrub growing wild in the mountains of East Africa, completely unaware of the extraordinary future waiting for it. That is where our story begins. As with many ancient stories, the beginning is not perfectly clear. History becomes less certain the farther back we travel. Records disappear, memories fade, facts blend together with tradition until it becomes difficult to separate one from the other. Rather than one dramatic discovery, the history of coffee appears to have unfolded slowly, almost quietly, over hundreds of years. In many ways, that makes its story even more interesting. Imagine standing in the Ethiopian highlands sometime around the 9th century. There are no highways stretching across the landscape, no cities glowing at night, no airplanes tracing lines through the sky. The mountains are covered with forests that have grown largely untouched for generations. Morning arrives gently here. Cool mist settles into the valleys before the rising sun gradually warms the hillsides. Birds call to one another from the trees, streams wind lazily through the countryside, and life follows rhythms that have remained unchanged for centuries. Among these forests grows a modest evergreen shrub. It isn't especially tall, and from a distance it doesn't demand attention. Its leaves are dark green and glossy, reflecting sunlight after an overnight rain. During certain times of the year, clusters of bright red cherries appear among the branches. To someone walking past, they would simply look like another fruit among countless others growing throughout the forest. Inside each cherry are two pale seeds. Those seeds, once dried and roasted, would eventually become what we know as coffee beans. Of course, no one living in these mountains would have thought of them that way. To them, they were simply part of the landscape. One plant among thousands. Useful perhaps, but hardly world-changing. History has a funny habit of hiding extraordinary things inside ordinary moments. The wheel was once just an unusual idea. Paper was once a strange experiment. Chocolate was once an unfamiliar bean. Coffee was no different. Long before it became a global commodity, it was simply waiting for someone to become curious enough to pay attention. Curiosity, more than almost any other human quality, has shaped the course of civilization. Nearly every important discovery begins the same way. Someone notices something that others overlook. They ask a question, they experiment, they fail a few times, then they discover something entirely unexpected. The most famous story about coffee begins with exactly that sort of curiosity. You may have heard the legend before. According to tradition, a young Ethiopian goat herder named Kaldi noticed that several of his goats were behaving rather strangely after eating bright red berries from a nearby shrub. Instead of settling down as evening approached, they bounded energetically across the rocky hillsides. They climbed over boulders, chased one another through the fields, and seemed unusually lively long after sunset. Naturally, Kaldi wanted to know why. Some versions of the legend say he sampled the berries himself before carrying a handful to a nearby monastery. Others say he simply showed them to the monks and asked what they thought. The details change depending on who tells the story, but the ending is usually similar. The berries, or more specifically, the seeds hidden inside them, eventually found their way into a fire. As they roasted, they released an aroma unlike anything anyone had experienced before. Rich, warm, slightly sweet, deeply inviting. Intrigued, the monks gathered the roasted seeds, crushed them, poured hot water over them, and unknowingly prepared one of history's first cups of roasted coffee. It is a wonderful story. Unfortunately, it is almost certainly not true, at least, not literally. The legend of Kaldi doesn't appear in written records until several hundred years after coffee was already widely known throughout the Middle East. Most historians believe it was created as a way of explaining coffee's mysterious beginnings rather than documenting an actual event. But legends don't survive for centuries because they're historically perfect. They survive because they capture something timeless about human nature. Whether Kaldi existed or not almost doesn't matter. Someone noticed the plant, someone became curious, someone experimented, and somewhere, over many generations, people slowly discovered that these humble little seeds held remarkable possibilities. The real story of coffee is probably less dramatic than the legend, but in many ways, it's even more fascinating. Rather than a single discovery made on a single afternoon, coffee's rise appears to have been the work of countless ordinary people whose names have long since disappeared from history. Farmers, travelers, families, merchants, and farmers, travelers, families, merchants, and monks each added a small piece to the puzzle. None of them could have imagined that one day their quiet experiments would help shape a drink enjoyed in nearly every corner of the world. As our evening continues, we'll leave the forests of Ethiopia behind and follow those first coffee seeds across the narrow waters of the Red Sea, where an entirely new chapter of the story begins. When we left our story, coffee was still a quiet mystery of the Ethiopian highlands. It grew wild beneath the forest canopy, known only to the communities who lived among the mountains. Its future was impossible to predict. There were no sprawling plantations, no cafés filled with conversation, and certainly no expectation that this modest plant would someday become one of the most traded agricultural products in the world. History, however, rarely changes all at once. More often, it moves gradually, carried forward by ordinary people making ordinary decisions. A merchant decides to visit a new port. A sailor loads an unfamiliar bundle onto a boat. A traveler returns home with seeds tucked among the rest of their belongings. None of these moments seem particularly important on their own, yet over time, they connect like links in a chain, creating changes that no single person could have foreseen. The next chapter in coffee's story begins with one of those quiet journeys. If you were standing on the eastern coast of Africa and looked across the Red Sea, the opposite shore might seem surprisingly close. At its narrowest point, the distance between Africa and the Arabian Peninsula is only a few dozen miles. Even 1,000 years ago, these waters were far from isolated. They formed part of an active network of trade connecting Africa, Arabia, Persia, and beyond. Wooden sailing vessels crossed these waters regularly, relying on seasonal winds that sailors had learned to understand through generations of experience. Their ships were not especially large by modern standards, but they were remarkably capable. Built from sturdy timber and fitted with triangular sails, they carried spices, incense, woven cloth, precious metals, animal hides, and countless other goods that found eager buyers in distant ports. Yet perhaps the most valuable cargo aboard those ships was something that could not be packed into crates: ideas. Every voyage carried knowledge from one place to another. Farmers shared new methods of cultivation. Craftsmen introduced unfamiliar techniques. Languages borrowed new words. Religions spread through conversation. Recipes changed as ingredients crossed borders. Long before the internet or even printed books, trade routes served as highways for human knowledge. Coffee became part of that exchange. No historian can point to the exact ship that first carried coffee across the Red Sea, nor can we identify the individual who first decided the plant was worth transporting. The historical record simply doesn't preserve details that specific. Instead, we see coffee appearing gradually in the Arabian Peninsula, where it found conditions that allowed it to flourish in an entirely new way. The region that played the most important role was Yemen. Today, many people picture Yemen as a dry desert landscape, and while deserts certainly exist there, the Western Mountains tell a different story. Rising high above the coastal plains, these mountains capture moisture from seasonal weather patterns, creating cooler temperatures and fertile valleys. Villages cling to steep hillsides, and for centuries farmers carved remarkable terraces into the mountains themselves. Seen from a distance, these terraces almost resemble giant staircases built into the landscape. Each level created a small patch of farmland where crops could be grown despite the challenging terrain. Building and maintaining these terraces required extraordinary effort. Stone by stone, generation after generation, families shaped the mountainsides into productive farmland. It was patient work, the kind that might take decades before its full benefits became clear. Coffee found a home here. Unlike the wild shrubs of Ethiopia, coffee in Yemen began to receive careful human attention. Farmers selected healthy plants, tended them through the growing season, protected them from disease, and harvested the fruit by hand. This marked an important turning point. Coffee was no longer simply something discovered in nature. It had become a cultivated crop, one that people intentionally grew because they recognized its value. That value, however, was not immediately measured in money. For many of the earliest coffee drinkers, the appeal was practical. The beverage helped people remain alert during long hours of study and prayer. Religious communities, particularly within Sufi traditions, are believed to have embraced coffee as a way of maintaining focus during nighttime devotional practices. Imagine a quiet gathering illuminated only by oil lamps. Outside, the night is still. Inside, a kettle gently simmers over glowing coals, while a simple drink is passed from one person to another. The purpose was not indulgence, it was attentiveness. Over time, preparing coffee became something of an art. The fruit surrounding the seeds was removed. The seeds themselves were dried beneath the sun. Eventually, they were roasted, a step that transformed them completely. Heat unlocked hundreds of aromatic compounds hidden within the beans. The grassy scent of the raw seed disappeared, replaced by the rich, familiar fragrance that fills kitchens and cafés even today. It is difficult to overstate how remarkable roasting really is. A green coffee bean has very little resemblance to the dark brown bean that eventually ends up in a grinder. As the temperature rises, moisture trapped inside the bean begins to expand. Natural sugars slowly caramelize. Oils move toward the surface. The bean changes color, grows larger, and develops an entirely new character. Even now, experienced coffee roasters often describe their work with the language of craftsmanship rather than manufacturing. They speak about balance, patience, timing, and listening for the subtle cracking sounds that signal different stages of the roast. Those sounds have echoed for centuries. Imagine standing near a small roasting pan. In 15th century Yemen, the fire crackles softly beneath the metal. Someone gently stirs the beans to keep them from scorching. A warm aroma begins to rise into the evening air, growing richer with each passing minute. It is a scent that people from that time would recognize immediately, and one that millions of us would recognize just as quickly today. Some experiences bridge enormous distances in time. The smell of fresh bread, rain falling on dry earth, wood smoke drifting through cool air. Freshly roasted coffee belongs comfortably on that list. As coffee became more widely appreciated, demand slowly increased. Farmers expanded cultivation. Merchants included coffee among the goods they traded, and ports along Yemen's western coast became increasingly important. One city in particular would become so closely associated with coffee that its name entered languages around the world. That city was Mocha. Today, many people recognize the word mocha as a flavor combining coffee and chocolate. But centuries ago, Mocha was first and foremost a busy port overlooking the Red Sea. Ships departed its harbor carrying sacks of carefully prepared coffee beans toward markets across the Middle East and eventually beyond. For generations, if someone purchased coffee in distant lands, there was a good chance it had passed through the docks of Mocha before beginning the next stage of its journey. The people loading those ships could not have known that they were exporting far more than an agricultural product. They were exporting a habit, a ritual, a reason for strangers to gather around the same table, and before long, those gatherings would give rise to something entirely new, the coffee house. In our next section, we'll step inside the world's earliest coffee houses, where merchants negotiated deals, scholars debated ideas, travelers exchanged stories, and an ordinary drink quietly became the center of extraordinary conversations. By the time coffee had become an established crop in Yemen, something else had begun to change as well. The drink itself was certainly becoming more popular, but perhaps even more important was what happened whenever people gathered to enjoy it together. There is an interesting pattern that appears again and again throughout history. Human beings have always looked for places where they can pause for a while, share stories, exchange ideas, or simply enjoy the company of others. Sometimes those places have been village squares. Sometimes they have been marketplaces, inns, libraries, public gardens, or taverns. The setting changes from one culture to another, but the desire remains remarkably consistent. Coffee, it turned out, was perfectly suited to these gatherings. Unlike alcoholic drinks, which often encourage people to slow down or become less focused, coffee had almost the opposite effect. It invited conversation. It helped people remain alert. Discussions stretched longer into the evening. Travelers arriving from distant cities could sit for hours exchanging news. Merchants could negotiate agreements without feeling rushed. Students could continue studying after sunset, while scholars debated philosophy, science, and religion late into the night. Slowly, almost naturally, places dedicated to serving coffee began to appear. The earliest coffee houses were not luxurious establishments. Many were quite simple. Imagine walking through a narrow stone street as the evening air begins to cool after a warm afternoon. Oil lamps flicker outside small doorways, casting soft pools of golden light onto the road. From somewhere nearby comes the familiar aroma of freshly roasted coffee, drifting gently through the neighborhood. As you step inside, the room is comfortably modest. Wooden benches line the walls. Woven rugs soften the floor beneath your feet. Copper pots rest over glowing charcoal, while the quiet sound of conversation fills the air. There is no loud music competing for attention, no rush to finish your drink and leave. People arrive because they have time to spend. Some visitors sit quietly by themselves, enjoying a few peaceful moments before returning to their daily responsibilities. Others gather in small groups, speaking in calm voices about everything from local harvests to distant politics. A merchant describes conditions in a city hundreds of miles away. A sailor recounts a recent voyage across rough seas. Someone shares a story passed down through generations of their family. Another person listens more than they speak, content simply to observe the conversations unfolding around them. In many respects, these coffee houses became something much larger than businesses. They became community spaces. One of the remarkable things about conversation is that ideas rarely remain with the person who first speaks them. A single thought can travel surprisingly far. One traveler hears an interesting story and repeats it in another city. A student shares something learned from a teacher. A merchant carries news along with their goods. Before long, knowledge begins moving through society almost as efficiently as trade itself. Coffee houses became ideal places for this exchange. Historians sometimes refer to them as centers of intellectual life, but that description can make them sound far more formal than they really were. They were lively, welcoming places where people from different backgrounds happened to find themselves sitting at neighboring tables. A wealthy merchant and a young apprentice might both order the same drink. A scholar could find themselves speaking with a sailor who had visited ports they had only read about. Farmers, craftsmen, religious leaders, poets, musicians, and travelers all contributed to the atmosphere in their own way. Every person entered carrying a different story. Every person left having heard a few more. It's easy to imagine that life moved more slowly hundreds of years ago, and in many respects it certainly did. Travel required patience. News could take weeks or months to arrive. A journey that today lasts a few hours might once have occupied an entire season. Yet people were no less curious than we are today. They wanted to know what was happening beyond the horizon. They wondered about distant kingdoms, unfamiliar customs, and new inventions. They enjoyed hearing stories of remarkable people and extraordinary places. Coffee houses became one of the few locations where all of that information naturally gathered. If you closed your eyes while sitting in one of those rooms, you would probably notice how peaceful the atmosphere really was. Cups resting gently on wooden tables, soft laughter from the corner of the room, someone carefully pouring another serving from a long-handled pot. Outside, footsteps pass along the street while the evening slowly settles over the city. There is something comforting about imagining these ordinary moments. History often focuses on dramatic events, battles, revolutions, coronations, and discoveries. Those moments certainly matter, but they are only a small part of the human experience. Most people throughout history spent their lives doing things that would feel very familiar to us today. They worked, they shared meals, they raised families, they worried about tomorrow, they laughed with friends, they rested after long days. Perhaps that is one reason coffee has remained so enduring. It fits naturally into everyday life. You do not need a celebration to enjoy a cup of coffee. You don't need a holiday or a special occasion. It can accompany a quiet sunrise, a thoughtful conversation, a rainy afternoon, or a peaceful evening. For centuries, coffee has simply been there, waiting patiently in the background while life unfolds around it. As coffee houses grew in popularity throughout the Arabian Peninsula, they also attracted attention from those in positions of authority. Large gatherings of people have always been viewed with a certain amount of curiosity by rulers. Whenever people come together regularly, they exchange more than stories. They exchange opinions, questions, and sometimes criticism. Not everyone viewed that as a positive development. At various points in history, some local leaders attempted to restrict or even ban coffee houses, worrying that they encouraged political discussion or challenged existing authority. These efforts were usually temporary. Coffee had already become too deeply woven into daily life. Closing one coffee house often meant another quietly opened somewhere else. The conversations continued. In a way, that persistence says something meaningful about human nature. People will always seek places where they feel connected to others, whether those places are ancient coffee houses, neighborhood cafes, libraries, or community parks. They satisfy a need that has remained remarkably constant across the centuries. We are, after all, storytelling creatures. We enjoy listening almost as much as speaking. We learn through conversation, and we remember the places where good conversations happen. By the early 16th century, coffee had become firmly established throughout much of the Middle East. Its reputation continued to spread alongside merchants, diplomats, pilgrims, and explorers. Every new city that embraced coffee added another chapter to its story. Soon, the drink would arrive in one of the greatest cities on Earth at the time, a place where Europe and Asia nearly touched, where towering mosques overlooked crowded markets, and where ships arrived daily from every corner of the known world. That city was Constantinople, known today as Istanbul. There, coffee would become more popular than ever before, and from its bustling streets, it would begin the next stage of an extraordinary journey toward the rest of the world. As the 16th century unfolded, coffee continued its steady journey northward, following the same roads and sea routes that had carried silk, spices, precious metals, and ideas for hundreds of years. By now it had already earned a loyal following throughout much of the Arabian Peninsula, but its arrival in Constantinople marked the beginning of something much larger. To understand why, it helps to picture the city as it existed nearly 500 years ago. Constantinople was one of the great crossroads of the world. Situated between Europe and Asia, it stood where continents seemed almost to reach out and touch one another. Ships entered its harbors from the Black Sea, the Mediterranean, North Africa, and beyond. Caravans approached its gates carrying goods from Persia, Central Asia, and distant corners of the Ottoman Empire. Languages from dozens of cultures echoed through its streets, and its marketplaces offered products that many visitors had never seen before. For travelers arriving by sea, the skyline itself must have been unforgettable. Towering domes caught the morning sunlight. Slender minarets stretched high above the rooftops. Stone walls surrounded neighborhoods that had grown layer upon layer over centuries of history. The air carried a mixture of scents that changed from one street to the next. Fresh bread baking in neighborhood ovens, fish unloaded from boats along the waterfront, incense drifting from places of worship, leather workshops, spice merchants, flower vendors, and somewhere nearby, the increasingly familiar aroma of freshly roasted coffee. Unlike many foods or drinks that spread slowly through a population, coffee seemed to find enthusiastic supporters almost immediately. Part of its appeal was remarkably simple. It tasted unlike anything else. Sweet drinks had long been enjoyed throughout the region. Herbal infusions were common. Various fermented beverages had existed for centuries. Coffee, however, occupied a category all its own. It possessed a rich bitterness balanced by layers of aroma that changed depending on how the beans were roasted and prepared. Every cup invited people to slow down just enough to appreciate it. Preparation itself became something worth watching. Imagine entering a coffee house in Constantinople during the late afternoon. A small copper pot rests over glowing coals. Water begins to simmer, never quite reaching a rolling boil. Finely ground coffee is carefully added, and almost immediately a fragrant foam begins rising toward the top of the pot. The person preparing it watches closely, lifting the pot from the heat at just the right moment before returning it again. This process might be repeated several times, each step requiring attention rather than haste. To modernize, accustomed to electric coffee makers that finish brewing in a matter of minutes, the process might seem wonderfully patient. Nothing is rushed. Even the serving reflects that sense of care. The finished coffee is poured into small cups without handles, often accompanied by a glass of cool water. The water serves a practical purpose. By cleansing the palate beforehand, it allows the drinker to notice the full character of the coffee itself. It is a small gesture, but one that reflects an appreciation for slowing down and paying attention. That idea of slowing down appears again and again throughout coffee's history. Although many people today think of coffee as fuel for busy schedules, it originally encouraged something quite different. Drinking coffee was rarely something done while walking quickly from one place to another. Instead, it was an invitation to remain where you were for a while. Conversations unfolded naturally because no one expected them to end after just a few minutes. Hours could pass almost unnoticed. A merchant might begin the afternoon discussing shipments arriving from Alexandria and finish the evening listening to stories from a traveler who had crossed the mountains of Anatolia. A young student could spend the day copying notes before pausing for coffee and finding themselves in conversation with an experienced scholar. Musicians sometimes performed quietly in the background. Poets recited their latest verses. Storytellers entertained groups gathered around them, weaving tales that blended history, folklore, humor, and imagination. Long before radio, television, podcasts, or the internet, these storytellers served as one of society's great sources of entertainment. Picture an elderly storyteller settling onto a simple wooden chair while the room gradually falls quiet around him. His audience leans forward slightly, coffee warming their hands as he begins another familiar tale. Perhaps it is the adventure of a clever merchant who outwitted. Perhaps it is the adventure of a clever merchant who outwitted a greedy ruler. Perhaps it is an old legend passed down through generations. Perhaps it is the account of a traveler who claimed to have visited lands so distant that few listeners could even imagine them. Whether every story was completely true mattered less than the experience of hearing it together. In that sense, coffeehouses became early homes for shared storytelling. It is comforting to think that, despite all the changes the world has experienced over the centuries, people still gather for remarkably similar reasons. Friends meet over coffee after years apart. Families catch up around kitchen tables. Colleagues discuss new ideas in neighborhood cafés. Students prepare for exams while sipping from oversized mugs. The furniture may have changed. The buildings may look different. Yet the simple act of sharing a drink while exchanging stories has remained surprisingly constant. As coffee became woven into everyday life throughout Constantinople, demand continued to grow. More beans arrived from Yemen each year, and merchants recognized just how valuable this trade had become. At the same time, those controlling coffee production understood something equally important. They possessed something the rest of the world wanted. For a time, producers in Yemen worked carefully to protect that advantage. According to many historical accounts, coffee beans intended for export were often processed in ways that made them unable to germinate. If other regions could not grow coffee themselves, they would remain dependent on imports from Yemen and the surrounding trade network. From a business perspective, it was an understandable strategy. If only one region could successfully cultivate coffee, that region would naturally benefit from steady demand and favorable prices. For many years, the approach worked remarkably well. Coffee spread to more cities, more households, and more coffee houses, but almost all of it could still be traced back to the same general region where cultivation had become established centuries earlier. Of course, history has a habit of surprising those who believe they can keep valuable knowledge contained forever. Curious travelers continued to visit. Merchants asked questions. Botanists examined unfamiliar plants. Explorers searched for opportunities that others had overlooked. Eventually, despite every effort to protect the coffee trade, living coffee plants and fertile seeds would make their way beyond the Arabian Peninsula. When that happened, coffee would begin growing in entirely new parts of the world. The next chapter of our journey will take us across the Mediterranean and into Europe, where this unfamiliar dark beverage would first be greeted with suspicion, then curiosity, and finally overwhelming enthusiasm. Before long, coffee houses would appear in cities like Venice, London, Paris, and Vienna, changing not only how people drank, but how they worked, learned, debated, and imagined the future. By the early 17th century, coffee had already traveled farther than anyone in the Ethiopian highlands could have imagined. What had once been a quiet forest plant had become a valued crop, a thriving trade, and the centerpiece of countless conversations throughout the Ottoman world. Yet perhaps its greatest transformation was still ahead. The next stage of coffee's journey would carry it into Europe. Like many new ideas and unfamiliar foods, coffee did not arrive all at once. It appeared gradually, carried by merchants returning from distant ports, diplomats visiting foreign courts, and travelers eager to bring home something unusual. The Mediterranean had long served as one of the busiest highways in the world, connecting North Africa, the Middle East, and Southern Europe through an endless exchange of goods and culture. One of the first European cities to embrace coffee was Venice. To picture Venice during this time is to imagine a city unlike almost any other. Instead of wide roads, there were canals. Instead of wagons rolling through crowded streets, elegant boats glided silently across the water. Stone bridges connected neighborhoods built upon more than 100 small islands, while merchants from across Europe and Asia crowded the docks each day, unloading silk, spices, perfumes, glassware, and rare treasures from lands many Europeans would never see for themselves. Among these exotic imports was coffee. At first it was considered something of a luxury. The beans were expensive, the preparation unfamiliar, and very few people knew exactly what to make of this dark, bitter drink. In fact, many Europeans were skeptical. Imagine being offered your very first cup of coffee after spending your entire life drinking water, wine, ale, or herbal infusions. The aroma alone would have been unlike anything you had encountered before. The color was darker than most beverages people were accustomed to seeing. The bitterness surprised many first-time drinkers. Some people loved it almost immediately. Others needed time. History is full of examples like this. Tomatoes, potatoes, chocolate, tea, and even bananas were all unfamiliar to much of Europe before gradually becoming everyday foods. New flavors often require patience. The first taste introduces something unexpected. The second begins to feel familiar. Before long, people wonder how they ever lived without it. Coffee followed a similar path. As merchants continued bringing beans into Venice, curiosity slowly replaced hesitation. Small shops began serving the drink to customers interested in trying this unusual import from the East. Physicians debated its health effects. Religious leaders discussed whether it should be encouraged or discouraged. Ordinary citizens simply wondered what all the excitement was about. One story from this period has become particularly famous. According to tradition, some church officials questioned whether coffee, because of its popularity in the Islamic world, should be rejected by Christian Europe. The matter was supposedly brought before Pope Clement VIII toward the end of the 16th century. After tasting the beverage himself, the story goes, he enjoyed it so much that he joked it would be a shame to leave such an excellent drink exclusively to others. Whether every detail of that story is perfectly accurate remains uncertain, but it reflects something important. Coffee had crossed cultural boundaries. It was no longer viewed solely as a drink from distant lands. It was becoming part of European life as well. As demand increased, coffee houses began appearing across the continent. Each city gave them its own character. In Venice, they became places where merchants paused between meetings, travelers exchanged news from overseas, and artists found quiet corners to sketch or write. In London, coffee houses earned an unusual nickname. They became known as penny universities. The reason was simple. For the price of a single penny, the cost of a cup of coffee, a person could enter, sit for hours, and listen to conversations involving merchants, philosophers, scientists, politicians, writers, and inventors. Books were discussed, newspapers were read aloud, business partnerships formed over steaming cups placed on worn wooden tables. Education, in a sense, became available to anyone willing to listen. Imagine walking into one of these London coffee houses on a rainy afternoon around the year 1700. Outside, horses pull wagons through muddy streets while merchants hurry beneath umbrellas made from heavy cloth. The city is noisy, busy, and constantly growing. Inside the coffee house, however, the atmosphere feels different. The room is comfortably warm. Fresh coffee fills the air with its familiar aroma. A group of sailors argues about weather conditions in the Atlantic. Nearby, a merchant studies shipping records while waiting to meet a business partner. In another corner, two young writers debate a newly published essay. Someone unfolds a newspaper that arrived only hours earlier, reading the latest headlines aloud to anyone interested in listening. If you remained there long enough, you might hear discussions ranging from astronomy and mathematics to gardening, architecture, or poetry. There was no schedule, no formal lecture, just curiosity moving naturally from one person to another. Many historians believe these coffee houses quietly influenced the development of modern society. Ideas that would eventually shape governments, businesses, scientific discoveries, and financial institutions often began as conversations between ordinary people seated around simple wooden tables. It is fascinating to think about how many important moments in history began not inside palaces or government buildings, but inside neighborhood coffee houses. A question asked over coffee, an idea sketched onto a scrap of paper, a chance meeting between two strangers. History is often built from moments that seem completely ordinary while they are happening. Meanwhile, coffee itself continued changing. Roasters experimented with different techniques. Brewers adjusted the way they prepared the beans. People discovered that coffee grown in different regions developed distinct flavors depending on climate, soil, elevation, and rainfall. Although the science behind these differences would not be fully understood for many years, experienced drinkers began recognizing that not all coffee tasted exactly the same. Some cups were brighter and fruitier, others were deeper, richer, and more earthy. Even then, people were beginning to appreciate what modern coffee lovers call origin. As coffee houses multiplied across Europe, demand grew faster than anyone had anticipated. Soon, importing beans alone would no longer be enough. European nations began asking an important question: what if coffee could be grown elsewhere? What if fertile coffee plants could be cultivated in distant colonies across the tropics? The answer to that question would reshape agriculture, international trade, and the economies of entire continents. In our next chapter, we'll follow coffee as it leaves its original homeland behind forever, taking root in places like India, Java, the Caribbean, Central America, and South America, where vast plantations would transform coffee from a regional specialty into one of the world's truly global crops. By the beginning of the 18th century, coffee had become one of Europe's most desired imports. Every year, more ships arrived carrying sacks of beans harvested in the mountains of Yemen and traded through the busy port of Mocha. Demand continued to rise, and merchants were more than happy to meet it. Coffee houses were opening in city after city, and what had once been considered an exotic curiosity was quickly becoming an everyday habit. But success created a new problem. There simply wasn't enough coffee, or perhaps more accurately, there wasn't enough coffee being grown in places controlled by the nations that wanted to sell it. For generations, Yemen had managed to protect its position as the center of coffee cultivation. Living coffee plants rarely left the region, and fertile seeds were carefully guarded. Exported beans were often roasted or dried in ways that made them incapable of growing. It was an effective strategy. As long as no one else could cultivate coffee, buyers would continue returning to the same ports year after year. Of course, history has shown us many times that valuable plants rarely remain in one place forever. The story of coffee's spread across the globe is filled with explorers, merchants, botanists, and a surprising number of gardeners. Unlike stories of conquest or war, this chapter unfolds quietly, carried not by armies but by seeds tucked into pockets, wrapped in cloth, or carefully transported aboard ships, making journeys that lasted months. One of the earliest regions outside Arabia to begin cultivating coffee successfully was India. According to tradition, an Indian pilgrim named Baba Budan traveled to the Arabian Peninsula during the 17th century. At the time, taking fertile coffee beans out of Yemen was strictly prohibited. The legend says that before returning home, Baba Budan concealed 7 living coffee beans beneath his clothing and carried them across the sea to southern India. Whether every detail happened exactly that way is difficult to verify. As with many stories from this period, legend and history tend to blend together. Yet what we do know is that coffee eventually found fertile ground in the hills of southern India, where the climate proved well suited for cultivation. The journey had begun. From there, coffee's movement became increasingly difficult to stop. European colonial powers recognized its enormous economic potential. The Dutch, in particular, saw an opportunity. Rather than depending entirely on imported coffee, they wanted plantations of their own. They transported coffee plants to the island of Java, in present-day Indonesia, where volcanic soil, abundant rainfall, and warm temperatures created nearly ideal growing conditions. The experiment was a remarkable success. Coffee flourished. Before long, Java had become one of the world's most important coffee-producing regions. In fact, the island's name became so closely associated with coffee that centuries later, people would casually refer to a cup of coffee simply as a cup of Java. Even today, the expression survives, long after most people have forgotten where it originated. It is one of those small reminders that history often hides in everyday language. We repeat words without realizing they carry stories hundreds of years old. As coffee cultivation expanded, so too did the complexity of its journey. Growing coffee was no simple task. Coffee trees required patience. A newly planted tree would not produce a meaningful harvest for several years, and even mature trees demanded careful attention. Farmers watched rainfall closely. They pruned branches to encourage healthy growth, protected plants from disease, and harvested the cherries only when they reached the proper stage of ripeness. Unlike grains that could often be gathered all at once, coffee cherries ripened gradually. Walking through a plantation during harvest season would have revealed workers moving carefully from tree to tree, selecting only the deep red cherries while leaving greener fruit to mature a little longer. It was slow, meticulous work, repeated day after day beneath warm tropical skies. Inside, each cherry remained the same 2 small seeds that had once grown unnoticed in the forests of Ethiopia. The world around them had changed dramatically. The seeds themselves had not. Once harvested, the cherries entered another carefully managed process. The fruit surrounding the beans needed to be removed. Sometimes this was done by allowing the cherries to dry naturally beneath the sun before separating the layers. Other methods involved washing the fruit away with water before drying the beans. Each approach produced slightly different flavors, although people of the time would not have described. Even so, experienced merchants quickly learned that coffee from different regions developed distinct personalities. Beans grown at higher elevations often tasted different from those grown closer to sea level. Soil rich in volcanic minerals produced one character, while other environments created another. Rainfall, temperature, sunlight, and countless small environmental factors quietly shaped every harvest. Nature, it seemed, had become coffee's silent partner. As plantations multiplied throughout the tropics, coffee began appearing in places that had never known it before. The French introduced coffee to islands in the Caribbean. The Spanish encouraged cultivation in parts of Central and South America. Portuguese settlers recognized the tremendous potential of Brazil, whose climate would eventually prove almost perfectly suited to large-scale coffee production. The journey that had begun with a handful of shrubs growing wild in East Africa had now reached 3 continents. It is remarkable to pause for a moment and consider how extraordinary that transformation really was. No airplane carried those first plants. No refrigerated cargo ships protected them from changing temperatures. Every young coffee tree that survived an ocean voyage did so aboard wooden sailing ships, exposed to storms, salt air, unpredictable weather, and journeys that often lasted weeks or even months. Keeping a living plant alive under those conditions required patience, planning, and no small amount of luck. Many attempts surely failed. Some plants never reached their destination. Others arrived weakened beyond recovery, yet enough survived to change agriculture forever. As coffee became established across tropical regions, production increased year after year. More beans meant lower prices. Lower prices meant more people could afford coffee. More drinkers encouraged more planting, and the cycle continued. Without anyone planning it from the beginning, coffee had become part of an interconnected global economy. A farmer harvesting cherries in Brazil could never meet the merchant selling roasted beans in Amsterdam. The merchant in Amsterdam would never know the student enjoying a cup in Edinburgh. That student would never imagine the mountain village where coffee's story first began. Yet each person depended in some small way upon all the others. History often appears to be the story of kings and governments, but just as often, it is the story of quiet connections between ordinary people whose lives never cross directly. Coffee is one of the finest examples of those invisible connections. By the end of the 18th century, it had become far more than a regional beverage. It had become a global tradition. By the early 19th century, coffee had completed one of the most remarkable journeys in agricultural history. In just a few centuries, it had traveled from the forests of Ethiopia to the mountains of Yemen, through the markets of Constantinople, into the cafés of Europe, and across oceans to tropical plantations around the world. Yet despite all of that growth, one country was about to change coffee forever. That country was Brazil. Today, when people think of coffee-producing nations, Brazil is often the first that comes to mind. For well over a century, it has produced more coffee than any other country on Earth. Some years, nearly 1 out of every 3 cups of coffee enjoyed around the world has begun its life on Brazilian soil. That kind of dominance did not happen overnight. Like so much of coffee's history, it developed gradually. The story begins in the early 1700s, when coffee plants finally reached Brazil through a combination of diplomacy, determination, and, according to one famous story, a little bit of charm. The legend tells of a Portuguese military officer named Francisco de Melo Paleta, who was sent to what is now French Guiana to settle a border dispute. Officially, his mission had nothing to do with coffee. Unofficially, however, Portugal hoped he might find a way to obtain fertile coffee plants, something the French were reluctant to share. According to the story, Paleta impressed the governor's wife during his visit. As he prepared to leave, she supposedly presented him with a bouquet of flowers. Hidden inside that bouquet were several fertile coffee seedlings. Whether every detail unfolded exactly that way is difficult to know. Historians have debated the story for years, and like many historical legends, it has likely grown a little more colorful with each retelling. But one fact is beyond dispute. Coffee arrived in Brazil, and once it did, it found conditions that were almost unbelievably favorable. Imagine standing on a hillside in southeastern Brazil sometime during the early 19th century. The morning sun rises over broad, rolling landscapes, stretching far into the distance. Rich red soil covers the ground beneath your feet, nourished by ancient volcanic activity and countless generations of decaying plant life. Gentle rains arrive with remarkable consistency throughout the growing season. Warm days encourage steady growth, while cooler nights help the coffee cherries mature gradually. It is difficult to imagine a better home for coffee. As farmers recognized this potential, plantations expanded rapidly. Fields that had once grown other crops were gradually converted into coffee production. New roads connected farming communities to ports along the Atlantic coast. Warehouses appeared near shipping centers, while merchants developed increasingly sophisticated systems for transporting beans from inland farms to waiting cargo ships. Coffee was no longer simply an agricultural product. It had become the foundation of an economy. Entire towns grew because of coffee. Railroads were built to move coffee, Banks financed coffee harvests, ports expanded to handle coffee exports, even grand public buildings in cities such as São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro were, in many ways, monuments to the prosperity coffee had created. It is fascinating how one small seed can quietly reshape an entire landscape. If you had flown over southeastern Brazil during the late 19th century, you would have seen enormous plantations stretching toward the horizon. Row after row of neatly planted coffee trees followed the natural curves of the hillsides, their dark green leaves creating broad waves of color beneath the tropical sun. Harvest season brought extraordinary activity. Thousands of workers moved carefully through the fields, filling woven baskets with ripe red cherries. Horse-drawn wagons carried the harvest to nearby processing stations where the fruit was separated from the beans before being spread across large drying patios. Imagine those drying patios from above. Thousands upon thousands of coffee beans lay beneath the warm Brazilian sun. Workers slowly raked them throughout the day, turning the beans so they dried evenly. From a distance, the movement almost resembled waves rippling across a quiet beach. It was patient work. There were no shortcuts. Nature determined the pace. Rain meant covering the beans. Sunshine meant uncovering them once again. Every harvest depended upon weather that no one could control. In many ways, coffee farming has always been an exercise in optimism. A farmer plants trees knowing they may wait several years before the first meaningful harvest arrives. Each growing season brings uncertainty. Will the rains come at the right time? Will temperatures remain steady? Will insects damage the crop? Will storms arrive too early? Generation after generation, coffee farmers have asked themselves these same questions, and still they continue planting. There is something quietly hopeful about that. Coffee trees themselves are surprisingly beautiful. Most people never see them because they are so accustomed to the finished product sitting inside a bag on a grocery store shelf. Yet standing in the middle of a healthy coffee plantation feels remarkably peaceful. The trees are generally kept short enough for harvesting, creating rows that are comfortable to walk through. Their leaves remain glossy throughout much of the year, while delicate white flowers appear after seasonal rains. Those blossoms are one of coffee's lesser-known treasures. They last only a short time, but their fragrance is often compared to jasmine or orange blossoms. Imagine an entire hillside covered in those tiny white flowers. A gentle breeze carries their sweet scent through the warm morning air, while bees move quietly from blossom to blossom. Only weeks later, the flowers disappear, replaced by small green cherries that slowly ripen through shades of yellow and crimson until they are ready to harvest. It is another reminder that coffee's story begins long before roasting, long before grinding, long before brewing. It begins with a flower. As Brazil's coffee production continued expanding throughout the 19th century, ships departed its ports carrying millions upon millions of pounds of beans to Europe, North America, and beyond. Coffee had become truly global. A family enjoying breakfast in London might unknowingly drink beans harvested months earlier beneath the Brazilian sun. A student in New York preparing for examinations, a railway engineer in France, a fisherman in Portugal, a shopkeeper in Argentina. People who would never meet one another were connected by the same remarkable plant. The world, in subtle ways, was becoming smaller, not because distances had changed, but because ideas, products, and traditions traveled farther than ever before. Perhaps that is one reason coffee has endured through so many different eras. The world changes, the ritual remains. As the decades passed, coffee itself continued evolving. Instant coffee made preparation quicker for people with busy lives. Electric coffee makers simplified brewing in homes. Espresso machines became increasingly refined, allowing cafés to prepare drinks with remarkable speed while preserving rich flavor. New beverages appeared as different cultures adapted coffee to their own tastes. Some preferred it strong and black, others added milk. Some enjoyed sugar, others preferred spices such as cinnamon or cardamom. No single method became universally correct. Instead, coffee reflected the personalities of the people preparing it. One of the most interesting developments of the late 20th and early 21st centuries was a renewed curiosity about where coffee actually came from. For many years, roasted beans were often blended together before reaching consumers. People knew they enjoyed coffee, but they rarely knew much about the farms where it had been grown. Gradually, that began to change. Roasters started highlighting individual regions. Customers became interested in learning about altitude, rainfall, soil, and harvest methods. The names of places that had once been known only to growers began appearing on cafe menus around the world. Ethiopia, Colombia, Guatemala, Kenya, Costa Rica, Brazil. Suddenly, people were discovering that coffee carried the character of the landscape where it was grown. Just as grapes grown in different vineyards produce different wines, coffee grown in different climates develops unique qualities of its own. Some coffees are bright and citrus-like, others are rich with notes of chocolate. Some carry gentle floral aromas, others remind people of nuts, caramel, berries, or stone fruit. It almost seems impossible that all of those flavors begin with the same species of plant. Yet they do. Nature has always enjoyed surprising us. Today, there are coffee shops in bustling airports, quiet villages, mountain towns, busy financial districts, university campuses, suburban neighborhoods, and nearly everywhere in between. Some are elegant. Some are wonderfully ordinary. Some serve hundreds of customers each morning. Others know every regular by name. Despite their differences, they all participate in a tradition that stretches back more than 1,000 years. Think about that for a moment. The next time someone prepares a simple cup of coffee, they are unknowingly repeating a ritual shaped by Ethiopian farmers, Yemeni growers, Ottoman merchants, Venetian traders, Brazilian harvesters, countless sailors, roasters, cafe owners, and millions of ordinary people whose names history has quietly forgotten. Their lives overlap in ways they never could have imagined. A decision made centuries ago continues influencing mornings all over the world. That is one of history's quiet miracles. The most ordinary parts of modern life often have the longest stories. Good night.